in the thick jungles of the Pacific Theater. During the chaotic months of 1944, a group of battle-hardened U.S. Marines cautiously advanced through a maze of twisted vines, dense foliage, and the deafening calls of unseen wildlife. Their senses heightened by months of brutal combat and the constant threat of hidden Japanese forces. Yet nothing in their training, experience, or imagination could have prepared them for the sight that would emerge from the green haze like a surreal apparition, a relic of engineering and futility that seemed almost to mock the intensity of the war itself. Japanese Type 95 Hago tank, rusted, battle-worn, and yet still fully intact. Partially camouflaged by jungle growth, its steel hull scarred by previous skirmishes, yet remarkably preserved. Sitting there as though abandoned deliberately, waiting for them to stumble upon it, and the Marines froze, eyes widening as the realization struck them that the tank, long considered a formidable weapon in previous battles, was now a subject of absurdity and incredulity. Because as their leader ordered a test of fire, 50 caliber bullets from Browning M2 machine guns shredded the air and slammed into the tank with brutal force, only to pass straight through its thin armor as though the steel were nothing more than paper, leaving the Marines staring at one another with expressions that combined disbelief, exhilaration, and the irrepressible laughter that arises when danger and absurdity collide. And as the initial shock subsided, the suspense began to build again. Because while the tank appeared harmless under small arms fire, it still represented a war machine, a potential threat, and the uncertainty of whether it might yet contain hidden explosives or traps caused the Marines to approach it cautiously. Their hearts pounding, senses straining, every rustling leaf and snapping twig amplified into a harbinger of danger, while simultaneously the humor of the situation lethal machine rendered impotent by its own design, limitations filled the air with a tense, almost cinematic tension, the kind of suspense that makes men laugh and tremble in the same heartbeat. And as they circled the tank, inspecting its tracks, treads, and gun turret, they began to piece together the story of the vehicle, how it had likely been hastily deployed, how Japanese forces had counted on its mobility to support infantry assaults, and yet how the relentless American firepower, logistical superiority, and sheer weight of strategy had rendered it not just obsolete, but comically ineffective. And this realization only heightened the suspense because it symbolized a larger truth of the Pacific War, one that combined ingenuity, desperation, and the unpredictable chaos of jungle combat. As each Marine shared glances, smirks, and whispered exclamations, knowing that this moment, the encounter with the Hago tank, the laughter, the disbelief was a memory that would be recounted for decades, a story that embodied both the absurdity and the terror of war. And as they continued testing the tank with a controlled barrage of .50 cal rounds, the bullets puncturing the armor with almost no resistance, ricocheting through the interior, striking the wooden seats, dials, and controls inside. The suspense remained taut because every Marine instinctively knew that war was rarely so forgiving, that a single misstep, a concealed explosive, or a sudden sniper could turn hilarity into tragedy. Yet the combination of danger and absurdity created an electric atmosphere that heightened their focus, sharpened their nerves, and intensified the storytelling potential of the moment. Because here was history unfolding in real time, a tableau that illustrated both the ingenuity of Japanese armor design and the overwhelming superiority of American firepower. And as they continued their inspection, they could not help but marvel at the ingenuity, the sheer audacity, and the paradoxical futility of the tank itself, a vehicle intended to dominate the battlefield, now rendered harmless by the simplest measure of firepower. And this duality, power and impotence, threat and comedy saturated the air, creating a suspenseful tension that was almost palpable. A tension that would keep any audience riveted if the story were to be told in cinematic detail, because the Marines, fully aware of the absurdity and gravity of the encounter, had to balance laughter with caution, humor with strategy, observation with instinct, and in every glance toward the rusted turret, every cautious step around the tracks, every snap of the machine gun's fire, there was a narrative of suspense, surprise, and revelation. The perfect combination to engage viewers and ensure that the story of the Hogo tank would resonate for generations. Not just as a tale of combat, but as a lesson in the unpredictability, irony, and high stakes of war. And as they finally stood back to take it all in the mangled armor, the incongruous laughter. The proof that .50 caliber bullets could reduce a feared war machine to a spectacle, the suspense reached its apex. Because in that perfect blend of history, danger, and absurdity, the Marines were living a story that demanded to be remembered, narrated, and shared. A story that would capture the attention of anyone who heard it, ensuring that the audience would remain glued, hanging on every detail of this unforgettable encounter. And as the sun climbed higher, casting shafts of light through the dense jungle canopy, the Marines realized that the Hogo tank's position, partially hidden by foliage, had been carefully chosen for maximum concealment. Yet now, with the devastating effectiveness of their .50 caliber rounds, every bolt, every seam, every plate of thin armor became exposed to scrutiny. And this exposure created an almost cinematic tension that made each Marine acutely aware of the dangerous beauty of the scene. The way sunlight glinted off jagged metal, the way leaves shivered in the heat of spent bullets ricocheting through the hull, and the irony of the situation where a war machine built for fear now seemed almost impotent heightened the suspense as adrenaline surged through the soldiers' veins, their training guiding every cautious step, yet their human reactions responding to the absurdity of the moment, and they could not help but whisper to one another in astonishment, speculating about the crew that once occupied this vehicle, the battles it had survived, the desperate measures that must have gone into deploying it across the Pacific Islands, in the haunting thought that despite its apparent weakness, it had once carried men who risked their lives, firing upon American forces with determination and discipline. And this mixture of humor, disbelief, and respect created a paradoxical tension that made the scene feel alive, almost theatrical, like a tableau that demanded to be understood in all its complexity, where danger and comedy intertwined seamlessly, producing a visceral reaction that no simple story could capture fully. Yet the Marines were living it, step by cautious step. As they tested every aspect of the tank, probing hatches, examining the gun mount, even noting the faint scorch marks on the turret where smaller caliber rounds or grenades had impacted, all while maintaining the awareness that in war, unpredictability lurks in every shadow, and that even an apparently harmless relic could conceal lethal surprises. And so the suspense was constant, the tension unrelenting, with each Marine's heartbeat synced to the echo of their own weapon fire, each glance at the steel hull reinforcing the duality of the moment, that here lay a vehicle of destruction, rendered almost laughably obsolete by superior firepower. Yet the history, the stakes, and the human element gave it a gravity that no amount of humor could diminish. And as they finally gathered around the tank to discuss strategy, the conversation oscillated between laughter and sober reflection. As one Marine pointed out that this tank, with armor incapable of stopping .50 caliber rounds, represented not only Japanese engineering limitations, but also the brutal reality of jungle warfare, where improvisation and courage were often the deciding factors. And yet another Marine countered that the tank's mobility, speed, and history of ambushes had once made it a terrifying adversary. And this exchange, combining incredulity, humor, and analytical observation, heightened the narrative tension, creating a suspense that was almost tangible, because it forced each soldier and in the retelling, every viewer to consider the fragile balance between life and death in combat, the thin line between fear and laughter, between hysteria and immediacy, and the story became more than a technical anecdote. It became a lesson in human perception, in how the mind reconciles absurdity with danger, and how humor can coexist with terror in the most extreme circumstances. And as they continued their examination, noting dents, bullet holes, and faded paint markings, the Marines began constructing the mental narrative of this particular Hogo tank, where it had come from, how it had been used, which battles it had participated in, which Japanese crew members had lived and died within its steel confines, and which soldiers of the U.S. Marines had faced it, fired upon it, survived it, and now stood above it, marveling at the astonishing irony of its vulnerability. A vulnerability that transformed fear into curiosity, horror into laughter, suspense into narrative gold. Because the story of the tank could be told in countless ways, each emphasizing danger, bravery, absurdity, or historical context. Yet none could capture fully the electric tension experienced in that exact moment as bullets passed harmlessly through a war machine designed to kill and protect, a paradox so compelling that it made the Marines' memories sear with clarity, ensuring that every gesture, every sound, every reaction would be remembered, recounted, and dramatized. A story that demanded attention, that demanded suspense, that demanded the audience remain riveted from start to finish, because here was a moment that was simultaneously historical, technical, human, and absurd, the perfect combination for a cinematic, gripping, educational, and entertaining narrative. A narrative that would keep viewers' eyes glued to the screen, hearts racing, imaginations firing, and minds engaged, desperate to see what would happen next, to experience every nuance of a scene where courage, humor, danger, and history collided, where a simple .50 caliber bullet transformed a feared tank into a lesson in absurdity, suspense, and survival, and where every Marine on that jungle floor became a living witness to a story that transcended its immediate context, connecting the realities of war to the universal experience of shock, laughter, disbelief, and respect for human ingenuity, limitations, and the unpredictable chaos that defines combat. And as they finally stepped back to survey the tank from a wider perspective, the tension remained, because even with all the humor and relief, each Marine instinctively knew that the story of this Hogo tank would resonate far beyond the immediate battlefield, that it embodied lessons of vulnerability, bravery, and unpredictability that could captivate any audience, and that the suspense of discovery, the thrill of danger, and the absurdity of the moment were exactly what made history unforgettable, exactly what would compel viewers to stay engaged, exactly what transformed a rusted Japanese tank in the jungle into a narrative masterpiece that balanced fear, humor, suspense, and awe with flawless precision. And as the Marines lingered around the Hogo tank, the jungle itself seemed to participate in the drama, with sunlight filtering through thick leaves, casting moving shadows across the rusted steel, the faint hum of insects creating a background tension, and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot or rustle of a nearby lizard or bird amplifying the suspense, as if the natural world itself were holding its breath. Aware of the absurdity and danger coexisting in the same frame, and the Marines, trained to be alert in every situation, could not help but notice how even the most mundane elements, the angle of the tank tracks pressed into mud, the way vines clung to the turret, the subtle discoloration on the steel where water had pooled, added layers to the story they were living, each detail suggesting a history of movement, ambush, escape, and survival. And this awareness only deepened the tension, because it reminded them that although the tank was harmless against their current weapons, it had once represented mortal danger to soldiers not so fortunate. And the paradox of the machine's impotence versus its lethal history created a psychological suspense that gripped every Marine, compelling them to examine the vehicle more closely, to imagine the lives it had carried, the battles it had influenced, the orders its crew had followed, and the chaotic events that had led it to this quiet jungle clearing. And as they conducted this careful inspection, each Marine instinctively documented observations in his mind, dents that told stories of previous firefights, scorch marks that hinted at earlier ambushes, the texture of armor that revealed manufacturing limitations, the faint traces of paint numbers and insignia that provided identity and chronology, and even the remnants of personal belongings or storage inside the turret hinted at human presence, transforming the tank from a simple machine into a vessel of history, memory, and suspense. And the more they observed, the more layers of irony and astonishment emerged, because they realized that despite the tank's failure to resist their .50 caliber fire, Every element of its construction spoke to the ingenuity, resourcefulness, and desperation of the Japanese engineers who had designed it. A duality that was both inspiring and absurd. A tension that made laughter inevitable, yet respect unavoidable. And as the Marines continued their methodical examination, they could not ignore the deeper implications of the scene. That in the broader context of the Pacific War, countless soldiers had faced similar machines, often without the advantage of heavy automatic weapons or clear visibility, relying instead on courage, intuition, and sheer luck to survive. And this historical resonance added weight to the moment, transforming it from a simple, tactical encounter into a meditation on human ingenuity, the evolution of warfare, and the unpredictable consequences of technological development. And the Marines, fully aware of the gravity of this realization, found themselves alternating between playful jokes at the tank's expense and solemn reflections on the countless lives it had touched. And this oscillation between humor and gravity created a narrative tension, so rich that any audience hearing the story could feel the suspense, share the exhilaration, and understand the deeper historical significance all at once. And as the day wore on, shadows lengthening over the clearing, the Marines noted every small detail, how the turret swivel still moved with surprising ease despite rust, how the tracks bore imprints of previous terrain, how every bolt and seam told a story of manufacturing, maintenance, and battlefield wear. And with each discovery, the suspense built, because every element, every observation, every revelation was a layer added to the narrative of survival, vulnerability, and absurdity. A story that would captivate anyone who understood the delicate balance of fear and amusement, danger and absurdity, past and present. And the Marines knew instinctively that the memory of this tank, the laughter it inspired, and the lessons it embodied would endure far beyond the jungle, far beyond the war, and into the retelling of history. With suspense and astonishment carefully preserved in every recounting, and the deeper they delved into the tank's physical and symbolic presence, the more they appreciated the perfect harmony of irony, suspense, and revelation. Because the scene represented everything war could teach about vulnerability, ingenuity, unpredictability, and human reaction. A story that demanded to be shared, that demanded that listeners remain engaged from the first moment of discovery to the final reflection on its implications. A story so layered, so complex, so emotionally charged that it could only be told fully in a narrative of uninterrupted suspense. Laughter, awe, and respect, and as the Marines finally took a step back, observing the Hugo tank from multiple angles, capturing mental images, and committing details to memory. The suspense reached a subtle crescendo, because they knew that even though the immediate danger had passed, the story they were living, the absurdity of a lethal machine rendered harmless, the history it carried, the human imagination it inspired, would continue to ripple in their minds and in the minds of every future audience who heard of this unforgettable encounter. Perfect blend of tension, humor, and historical gravity that ensured engagement, emotional investment, and the kind of suspense that keeps viewers riveted to the narrative until the very end. And as the Marines lingered, the jungle seemed to amplify every sensation, every heartbeat, every whisper of movement, as if the environment itself were aware of the extraordinary moment unfolding. And the suspense was heightened with each careful step around the tank, because despite their laughter and incredulity, each Marine instinctively understood that war rarely offered moments of harmless absurdity, that beneath the humor lay the ever-present potential for danger. A single miscalculation, a concealed explosive, or the sudden return of enemy forces. And so every glance at the rusted turret, every inspection of the fragile armor, every test of the .50 caliber rounds carried the weight of both comedy and mortal seriousness, creating a dual narrative that was simultaneously entertaining and perilous, a combination that would captivate any viewer from the outset. Because the story was not merely about a machine, but about human ingenuity, resilience, and the unpredictable outcomes of conflict. And as they tested the tank further, firing round after round into the steel hull and observing the bullets punch through with almost no resistance, ricocheting inside and striking the dials, seats, and remaining instruments. The Marines were confronted with a paradox that fascinated and amused them. A vehicle designed for fear now rendered impotent by the simplest measures of American firepower. And yet, as they noted the dents, scratches, and historical battle damage, the presence of prior conflict, the human stories embedded in every seam, the Marines began to feel a profound respect for the lives that had passed through the tank. The courage and desperation of Japanese soldiers, and the chaotic interplay of design limitations and battlefield ingenuity, in this respect, combined with humor, created an emotionally complex narrative that mirrored the suspenseful highs and lows of the Pacific theater. A narrative that demanded careful observation, intellectual engagement, and emotional participation from anyone hearing it, because every detail, from the worn tracks to the turret mechanisms, from faded insignia to bent armor plates, contributed to a story that was simultaneously absurd, tragic, historical, and suspenseful. And as the Marines continued their analysis, they shared observations, laughter, and reflections, creating a dialogue that oscillated between comedy and solemnity, between incredulity and deep appreciation. And this oscillation produced a tension that was almost cinematic, a tension that would translate perfectly into a narrative designed to captivate viewers, hold attention, and maintain suspense throughout the story. Because the humor could never fully dissipate the underlying awareness of danger, history, and human vulnerability, and as the sun moved across the sky, casting dramatic shadows over the tank and the surrounding clearing, the Marines noticed subtleties they had missed earlier, the way vines intertwined with tracks, the residual rust patterns suggesting long-term exposure to the elements, the wear marks inside the turret indicating frequent operation, and even the faint remnants of past repairs, all of which added texture, depth, and realism to the story. And this meticulous attention to detail enhanced both suspense and engagement, because it allowed them to reconstruct a narrative not only of the tank itself, but of the soldiers who had operated it, the battles it had faced, the failures and triumphs embedded in steel and time, and the ultimate irony of a vehicle built for lethal force, now unable to withstand a single .50 caliber round. A situation that would be unforgettable for any audience. And as they finally gathered for a last sweeping observation, noting how the tank seemed almost absurdly small yet historically potent, the Marines could feel the culmination of discovery, amusement, and reflection coalescing into a narrative climax. One that blended suspense, humor, historical insight, and human emotion into a seamless experience, ensuring that the story they were living, and any story told about it, would remain riveting, unforgettable, and emotionally powerful, keeping viewers engaged, minds racing, hearts pounding, and curiosity piqued. Because the Hago tank had become more than a relic, it was a lens through which to view courage, innovation, vulnerability, absurdity, and the relentless, unpredictable nature of warfare. And as they finally stepped back, recording mental images, sharing last jokes, and reflecting on the strange juxtaposition of laughter and deadly history, the suspense did not dissipate. Because the narrative potential of this encounter, its lessons, its absurdity, and its historical significance would continue to resonate, ensuring engagement from the very first moment of discovery to the final reflection, a continuous thread of tension, humor, and awe that could captivate viewers endlessly. The sun hung low over the Pacific island, painting the dense jungle in a crimson hue, as the remaining U.S. Marines cautiously advanced toward a clearing where a Japanese Hago tank sat abandoned, its rusted steel glinting faintly in the dying light. And from the first step into the open, a tension unlike any other gripped the soldiers. A pulse-quickening blend of anticipation, fear, and disbelief. Because while this tank had already become legendary among their ranks for the way, 50 caliber bullets passed straight through its thin armor. The unknown variables of the moment, the unseen booby traps, the potential hidden explosives, the unpredictable movements of the terrain, created a suspense so palpable that even seasoned veterans could feel it tighten around their chests like a vice. And as they circled the tank, their weapons ready, eyes scanning the undergrowth, the history of the machine pressed heavily into their consciousness, designed to dominate, to inspire fear, to crush enemy infantry with its mobility and firepower. Yet here it sat, impotent, under the simplest of tests. A paradox that only amplified the suspense. For every Marine instinctively recognized that the juxtaposition of harmlessness and potential danger was the essence of true tension, the kind that could turn laughter into horror in a heartbeat. And as one of the Marines carefully examined the turret, noting scorch marks, dents, and faded insignia, he whispered to the others about the possible crew who had once operated the vehicle, their desperation, their bravery, their lives intertwined with steel and ammunition, and this human connection, juxtaposed against the tank's absurd vulnerability, 2.50 caliber bullets, created a cinematic blend of awe, humor, and suspense that could grip any audience, because it reminded them, Band would remind viewers, that war is never predictable. That technology and ingenuity can both inspire fear and render it meaningless depending on context. And as the group began testing the tank once more, firing bursts into the hull to watch rounds ricochet harmlessly, the combination of adrenaline, disbelief, and historical reflection reached a peak, because in this single moment, they witnessed the impossible, the symbol of terror reduced to a spectacle. Yet its history and potential danger remained, creating the perfect narrative tension for anyone experiencing the story. And as the Marines exchanged glances, smirks, and incredulous laughter, the suspense did not diminish. For they knew the climax was yet to come, that the audience of this story, we're told, would be hanging on every detail, every shot, every reaction, every bullet puncturing the steel, because each element combined danger, comedy, and historical truth into an unforgettable tableau. And as the last rays of sunlight struck the turret, casting long shadows over the ground, the Marines felt the culmination of emotion, tension, and narrative significance coalesce. A combination of amazement, fear, and the uncanny absurdity of warfare that only history could provide. And as they finally stepped back, observing the tank from a distance, the suspense reached its zenith, because they realized that this abandoned, vulnerable machine told a story far larger than any single battle. A story of courage, ingenuity, absurdity, and survival that demanded to be witnessed, remembered, and recounted with every ounce of detail preserved, ensuring that any audience would remain completely engaged from the first shot fired to the final reflection on the improbable, astonishing, and unforgettable spectacle of the Hago tank. A vehicle simultaneously fearsome and impotent, tragic and comical, historical and suspenseful, the perfect story to hold viewers rapt until the very last second.